Good evening. I'm Catherine Hill. I am President and CEO of Levine Museum of the New South, and I want to thank you for joining us for this very special What's It Going to Take? We launched this series of programs in response to the murder of George Floyd, to probe issues around racial violence and white supremacy, and to beg the question, what's it going to take to affect real change? You know, so many of us are surprised by these unconscionable acts of racial violence. This isn't the US we know, we say. And the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th stunned us. I mean, coups don't happen in America. But we are surprised only because the US history that we learned is not the US history that actually happened. As David Zucchino explains in his remarkable book, Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. David Zucchino is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a contributing writer for the New York Times, and a foreign correspondent who has reported from more than 36 countries. He is the author of Thunder Run, The Armored Strike to Capture Baghdad, and The Myth of the Welfare Queen. He is also a Tar Heel whose phone has not stopped ringing since January 6th because he can provide historical context for the insurrection at the Capitol like no one else. Dr. Michael Bitzer will serve as tonight's moderator, and Levine Museum is always so pleased to have Michael join us. He is the Leonard Chair of Political Science at Catawba College and a leading expert on North Carolina politics. He has authored 2 books, The New Politics of the Old South and The Future Ain't What It Used to Be, the 2016 presidential election in the South. You've heard Dr. Bitzer on MSNBC, on Fox News, NPR, NBC, ABC, all the local stations. You've read his interviews with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, it is an honor to share a Zoom room with you tonight. Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That was very warm and appreciative introduction. And I want to say thank you to the Levine Museum and to everybody on staff for giving us this opportunity to talk about this crucial event in both the state and national history, but also to try and pull it together to think about where we are today and what the lessons of history can tell us from 1898. Certainly, as somebody who has studied Southern politics and Southern history, I knew a little bit about what happened in Wilmington in 1898 as part of Jim Crow, as part of segregation and the rise of white supremacy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But I've met native North Carolinians and those from the South who don't realize and don't know anything about the Wilmington insurrection, that it was the only successful coup d'etat in American history of a local government through armed insurrection. And in 1898, 2 days after a very race-based election in North Carolina that saw white supremacist Democrats regain control of state government, a mob of white supremacists brought a campaign of terror to Wilmington, to what was then considered one of the largest cities in the state. But it would be over 100 years before North Carolina really came to terms with the history of this event in the form of a commission that reported in 2006 the following. And I want to read from David's excellent book in the epilogue. The commission estimated that 2,100 Black residents fled Wilmington during and after the violence. It documented 21 citizens banished by the coup's white leaders, 14 Blacks and 7 whites. It identified by name 13 Black men killed during the riot and listed 9 more dead men whose identities could not be confirmed, noting that the bodies of many Black victims were either quickly buried or never recovered. The commission estimated that the total number of blacks killed was at least 60. The report noted, quote, the ability of white leadership in Wilmington to develop long-range plans for instigating violence, a strategy to quell that violence, and their subsequent ability to call the affair a riot, implying a sudden break in peacefulness rather than reveal its true character, that of a planned insurrection. That was the lead up. That was the cause, that was the aftermath of David's excellent book, Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. And it's a real honor for me to introduce and welcome David to the Levine Museum of the New South.
Thank you, Michael. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I'm curious, the insurrection of 1898 came into stark relief, I think, for those of us who know about this particular event in conjunction with January 6th insurrection. And what I would like to do this evening is kind of talk about, maybe spend the first 20 minutes or so talking about the book and the Wilmington insurrection and your thoughts about it, but then kind of transition the conversation into thinking about comparable aspects to what I think we can make a connection between 1898 and 2021. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions from the audience. First off, I'm really curious. How did you find out about the Wilmington insurrection and what drew you to write this book?
I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I went to high school and college in North Carolina, and not once from any professor or any textbook did I ever hear about what was then called the Wilmington riot.
Yeah.
I did not know about it until 1998, 100 years after, when there were centennial observations and meetings and an attempt by the University of North Carolina in Wilmington to bring all the white and black community together. So there was a lot of press coverage of it. And that was the first time I'd heard of it, believe it or not. And I'd lived in North Carolina for quite a while and didn't know a thing about it. So to me, it was first of all shocking that I would not know about an event of this historical importance, not only to North Carolina, but to the country. Mm-hmm. And secondly, that something like this could happen in the United States of America. It's truly astonishing.
Yeah, I'm curious as to, the way that you set up the book. It's really not just an isolated incident in 1898, but rather one that seemed to really develop post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction. You've got the new state constitution of 1868, where the KKK was seeking to intimidate black enfranchised voters to vote for the new state constitution. At the time, whites were claiming massive voter fraud. What was Wilmington like after the Civil War up to the 1890s from your research?
It was really unusual and remarkable among southern cities of its size. It was the biggest city in North Carolina at the time, and it was one of the very few southern cities that had a majority black population. It was 56% black, but more importantly, it had black men in positions of influence, appointed and elected office in the city of Wilmington. That was very, very unusual at that time. You had 3 of the 10 aldermen were black men, and 10 of the 26 policemen were black men. The county treasurer, the county coroner, the superintendent of streets were black men. There were black magistrates, which really, really perturbed the white supremacists, because at times white men would appear before black magistrates. There were also a black postmaster and black letter carriers who delivered mail to the homes of whites when white women were alone at home, and that infuriated the white supremacists. So this was really a thorn in the side of the white supremacists who had been used to governing Wilmington and North Carolina After Reconstruction, they were in complete control up until the early 1890s, when there was a recession, and the poor white farmers who made up the Populist Party at the time, who had been in support of the Democratic Party, which at the time was the party of white supremacy, they just grew tired and weary of the Democrats, of the banks and the lawyers and the railroads that ran the party, and felt their interests were not being addressed. And they combined in what was then called fusion with white and black Republicans to take over the state legislature, and in 1897 to take over the city government in Wilmington. So during this time, the whites were seething because, as you mentioned, they had used the Klan before, during, and after Reconstruction to intimidate black men and to keep them from voting. That was happening across the South, but nowhere was the white supremacy campaign as successful as it was in Wilmington. And it really turned out to be a model for other white supremacists around the South after 1898. And a lot of states followed the model. So it was a real inspiration for white supremacists, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's always difficult for me to describe to my students, and particularly the change in the political parties. Yeah, particularly from that time period to today, and that at one point the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy, of segregationists, of Jim Crow laws, in the enactment of the disenfranchising constitutional amendment in 1900 in this state. You write about the face of white supremacy in really three kind of key characters: Alfred Waddell of Wilmington, Josephus Daniels, and Furnifold Simmons. Can you talk a little bit about who those men were and how they kind of shaped the dynamics of white supremacy during that time?
Yeah, I really think the most powerful figure among the white supremacists was Josephus Daniels, who was the publisher of the News and Observer, which, as everyone knows, is still published today. At the time, and still today. Well, then particularly, it was the most powerful and important paper in the state. And of course, this is a time when there's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio. Newspapers were the king of media, and the News and Observer had an outsized influence over public opinion, because it was really the only major source of news. And Josephus Daniels portrayed himself as a journalist, but in fact, he was a politician. He was a member of the Democratic Party Executive Committee, and believe it or not, he held Democratic Party meetings in the newsroom, in his office, where he would openly plot Democrats as part of what they called the white supremacy campaign. And Josephus called himself the militant voice of white supremacy. And during the summer and fall of 1898, he just planted hundreds of phony, what we would call fake news today, phony stories, trying to do two things. One was to convince white voters, and particularly poor white farmers, that black men were rapists, that there was a rape epidemic, and that white women were not safe. And that was a complete lie. There was no rape epidemic that summer. And secondly, he wanted to convince voters that black men were not intelligent enough to vote, did not deserve the right to vote, that only white men really had the right to vote. And secondly, that black men were incompetent and corrupt and could not be trusted to serve in government. And he came up with the term Negro rule and Negro domination, which appeared frequently in the News and Observer, to describe what he said was a takeover by black men of Eastern North Carolina, particularly Wilmington, which was not true at all. Furnifold Simmons was the chairman of the Democratic Party and was the real mastermind behind the entire white supremacy campaign. And Josephus was the propagandist. Furnifold Simmons was the political operative who controlled the violence by the red shirts, which were the vigilante arm of the white supremacy movement. They were basically an outgrowth of a Klan. He controlled them. He controlled the speakers who went out on the stump during that election year to incite white men to violence against black men, using some of these same themes that Josephus had published in the News and Observer. And Alfred Moore Waddell was a former colonel in the Confederate Army who been a congressman from North Carolina, a lawyer and a newspaperman, and was down on his luck by 1898. Didn't have a job, and his wife was actually teaching piano lessons to help survive. But he seized the moment there. He was a very Trump-like figure. He was an incredible speaker, very dramatic, very compelling speaker, and he was the lead speaker of the white supremacy campaign. And he was from Wilmington, lived in Wilmington, and he was sent out to give these stirring race-baiting speeches with a constant use of the N-word. And Josephus Daniels used the N-word often in print, which was pretty shocking to me. Between the three of these men, they really incited and primed white men to violence, and did an incredible job of holding this anger and fury back until the day of the coup, which was planned for 2 days after the election. The other part of the white supremacy campaign was to steal the election through intimidating black men and keeping them from voting, and secondly, literally stuffing ballot boxes on the day of the election.
It was fascinating, thinking and reading through your book that this wasn't just a reaction. This wasn't just a spur of the moment kind of an event. This was a long-term plan, driven politically, but also driven by race and gender roles in the South. And I found it fascinating that it was almost the spark that brought about the slow burn towards the insurrection was ironically by another newspaper man, Alexander Manley, who seemed to spark the outrage of whites about the relationship based on gender and race in the South. Right. Could you talk a little bit about Manley's role in all of this?
Alex Manley was just a interesting character. I mean, he was the most interesting character in the book. I mean, being a journalist, I was fascinated by Manley. He was actually the grandson of a white governor. His descendants often remarked when they looked at pictures of him, they thought he was white, and he could have, quote, passed as white as many mixed race people did because it was advantageous. He refused to pass. He lived his life as a proud black man. He started the Daily Record, which he called the only black daily in the world. It wasn't, but it was one of very, very few. It was very unusual to have a black daily newspaper. He even sold ads to white merchants, but he also really agitated against white supremacy and demanded that the state and federal government come through on the promises from the 1868 convention and from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to give citizen and voting rights to black citizens. His editorial came about in August. This was long before the election in November. He responded to a white woman in Georgia named Rebecca Felton, who had given a speech castigating the white men of Georgia for not lynching enough black men. She, like Josephus Daniels, falsely claimed that there was a rape epidemic in Georgia, and the white men weren't doing anything about it. And she said the only solution was lynch rope, and her quote was, "I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary." Well, Alex Manley read this and immediately responded the same day he found out about it with an editorial that had two main points. One, he said that most black men lynched for supposedly raping white women were in fact their consensual lovers. And secondly, that white men for generations had raped black women with impunity. Now, as you can imagine, this was just shocking to white people to read something like this, and it had an incendiary effect. And in fact, the red shirts, the vigilantes, wanted to lynch Manley and burn his newspaper that day. And to show you how calculated and premeditated the coup was, the leaders of the coup, including Furnifold Simmons, said, no, this is too early. We need to wait till closer till election day in November so we can use this as motivation to incite whites. But if we do it now, we'll sort of fire our bullet before the right time. So they convinced the red shirts to hold off, and they said, by the day of the coup, we will let you lynch Manley and we'll let you burn the newspaper. They did indeed burn the newspaper. Alex Manley was warned of the lynching a few days before the coup, and he barely escaped from Wilmington with his life.
And it wasn't just Manley as the source of the white supremacist terror campaign. It was really all of Wilmington's Black community, and in particularly the city government, run under this fusionist policy, but also staffed and had elected Black officials serving as the board of aldermen. Could you talk about the moment where Waddell and his group of white supremacists walk in and meet with the then mayor and several members of the board of aldermen?
Yeah, this was actually on the day of the coup, late in the afternoon on November 10th, 1898. And this was after several hours, beginning in late morning and through the afternoon, of armed white men, up to 2,000 at one point, just rampaging through the streets and murdering Black men at will. A lot of Black men were trying to get home from work and were murdered. As you said earlier, up to 60 or probably more than 60 were murdered. After this, then they carried out this carefully laid plan to overthrow the government, and they marched at gunpoint to City Hall and confronted the white mayor, the white police chief, and the 7 white councilmen and the 3 Black councilmen, and ordered them at gunpoint to resign. And they had no choice at all, and they all, quote, resigned. And the amazing part is that the perpetrators of the coup named themselves as aldermen. Waddell was named mayor. Another white leader of the coup was named police chief. So it was just remarkable. They claimed it was all legal, that it was not a forced resignation. It's just the board decided on its own to resign, and they claimed they had an election. Of course, an election among the perpetrators, among themselves, deciding which coup leader would be mayor and would serve on the council. And the most remarkable part of the whole thing is that no one was ever held responsible for the murders in the coup. There was never any sort of investigation or prosecution, and certainly no one was convicted. They completely got away with it and bragged about it for years in journals and diaries and letters.
It's just incredible. And, for so much of North Carolina's history after 1898, I think the event is oftentimes viewed and labeled a race riot, with the narrative that Blacks were going to stage an uprising, as you talked about, against whites. But this narrative really hides the fact that a lot of planning and strategy went into this event. Language, whenever I talk with my students, I always stress the importance. Language means a great deal, and words carry power with them. The fact that for so long in our history, this has been the Wilmington race riot, but it's only been since really the commission in 2000 and the report in 2006 that we're now saying the Wilmington insurrection or the Wilmington coup. Why do you think the change in the words that we use to describe this event are important in terms of thinking about what happened in Wilmington in 1898?
Yeah, well, first of all, this was a complete false narrative that was sold to history for almost a century by the perpetrators. As you said, during the summer and fall of 1898, through the newspapers and through these speeches, they warned whites that the black men were stockpiling weapons in churches, and they were doing militia drills and planning to murder white men, rape white women, take over the town, and create a black government, which was completely preposterous to anybody who lived in Wilmington. If you lived there, you know the whites all that summer and fall were arming themselves. The hardware stores ran out of guns and ammunition, and they had to telegraph to Richmond and Baltimore to bring in more weapons. And in fact, all the hardware dealers, the gun dealers were all whites, and they refused to sell to black men. So this narrative somehow caught hold, and some whites believed their own lies. They came up with committees to designate churches and other buildings as safe places for white women and children to go to be safe from the Black Riot that was coming. And in fact, even the coup leaders sent their families out of town before the coup, before the so-called race riot was going to break out. So they actually believed their own propaganda. But I think it's extremely important for history for us to know that it was completely the opposite. It was not a race riot. It was a white insurrection, and it was a white supremacist revolution that had repercussions that lasted almost a century. I mean, their two main goals were to keep black men from voting and to keep black men from holding office, and they were incredibly successful. In 1896, 2 years before the coup, there were 126,000 black men registered to vote. 126,000. 4 years after the coup, the number was down to 6,000, and it went down from there. And in fact, black citizens did not vote in any appreciable number in North Carolina, and also in many other southern states, until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And as far as elective office, after those three councilmen were forced to resign in 1898, no black citizen served on the Wilmington Town Council until 1972. And in 1898, there was one black member of Congress in the entire country, and he was from North Carolina. His name was George Henry White, and he was from a district next to Wilmington. And Josephus Daniels in the News and Observer hounded him, and ran him out of the state through editorials and phony news stories, using the N-word quite often. George Henry White left North Carolina saying, "I cannot live in North Carolina and be treated as a man." After he was driven from office in 1900, no black citizen served in the delegation or in Congress from North Carolina until 1992. That's almost 100 years later. So it was pretty incredible, the depth of change that they forced, and the ramifications of that coup that carried on for decades.
We're going to get to bringing it to 2021 here in just a minute, but I want to end this part of the event by just asking what may be a very simple question. What surprised you the most in doing the research and writing this book about the insurrection of 1898?
Several things. One was how carefully orchestrated and planned it was. Secondly, the fact that no one was ever held accountable, and that the federal government under William McKinley, who was a Union officer and an abolitionist, did absolutely nothing, even though they were warned before and after the coup that it was coming. And I guess the other thing that totally surprised me was the reporting of the white newspapers from around the country, because the plotters of the coup had announced well beforehand that they were going to do it. They said they were going to win by the ballot or the bullet or both. Everyone knew violence was coming, so all the northern newspapers sent their white reporters down. The New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Star, all these papers sent their reporters down. And the perpetrators of the coup would meet them at the train station, intercept them, give them cigars and whiskey, arrange for their lodging, and then they would also use what today we would call embedding. They would take these reporters around with the red shirts and the vigilantes around town, fill them with the white narrative that a black race riot was being planned. And the reason we're so well armed is we've got to put a stop to it. And then the other narrative was that these black men are incompetent and corrupt, and we have to get them out of government. And that was the story that America got. Those were the stories that all these white newspapermen sent back based on their interviews with the white supremacists. I could find no evidence, and I read a lot of news stories, that any of these reporters ever talked to a single black man, not one.
Wow. As I was reading your book and thinking about tonight's program, I just kept thinking so many issues that we are experiencing today were just as evident in the late 1800s, early 1900s. If you think about, government tactics in terms of state violence against Black Americans. Just this week, the $27 million settlement for the murder of George Floyd, the issues of voter fraud. I found it fascinating on page 315. I'm just going to read a couple of quick sentences that you wrote. In the Black Belt town of Scotland Neck, registered Republicans outnumbered Democrats nearly 2-1, but ballot stuffing produced a stunning 11-1 margin for the constitutional amendment that restricted Black North Carolinians' vote, with 831 yes ballots reported in a city where only 539 residents had registered to vote. After Black men won the right to vote in the state in 1868, nearly 80,000 registered. By 1900, the two white supremacy campaigns had whittled that number to just 15,000. Wild conspiracy theories, demagoguery, the power of the media, the use of political rallies to rile up supporters, the current spat of voter revision laws that we're experiencing. All of these issues, I think, are relevant today, but they were just as relevant 123 years ago. Talk a little bit about how you see particularly the use of extra legal or governmental action tactics when it comes to interactions with Black Americans.
Yeah, I was just shocked, particularly by January 6th, but during the entire Trump presidency, you mentioned demagoguery. That's really one of the parallels I see. I mentioned Colonel Waddell and some of the other speakers. They were very Trump-like figures and used the same tactics that Trump did. First of all, disinformation was key back in 1898, as we've talked about it, and it's been crucial to Donald Trump and the rise of Trumpism leading up to the January 6th attempt to overthrow the electoral college vote on that day and in Congress. There were also charges in 1898 of a stolen election. The whites challenged the fusionist victory in 1897 that brought them into power in Wilmington, and they claimed that there had been voter fraud, just like today. Voter fraud was a huge part of the January 6th insurrection, where you have Trump talking about open fraud, that the election was stolen from him. What's really interesting, I found, was that Trump focused really on four major cities, Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, and Philadelphia, and specifically on the African-American precincts when he charged fraud. And that was a very direct message to his supporters that these Black people are voting fraudulently. And that's what stole the election from us, because he did focus on those four cities. You remember in 2016, even when he won, he said 6 million illegal immigrants voted. So this is all part of the demagoguery to create sort of the other, a scapegoat that really focuses white rage. And you had the same thing in 1898 against black men on the rape issue and on the voting issue, telling whites that their birthright was being stolen from them. That was the message in 1898, that the so-called Negro rule was robbing you of your rights. In 2021, Donald Trump's message was that your country is being stolen from you. That was the very clear message. And the scapegoats that he identified were, of course, African Americans and immigrants, the other. And it's very, very effective if you can focus people's rage and resentment and grievances, which Donald Trump is brilliant at, by focusing on people who don't look like your supporters, immigrants, African Americans, gays, and using that to rile people to play on their insecurities and their fears. And in the case of Trump, he made it pretty clear without saying so that America is a white Christian country. The implication being that people of color and immigrants have no place in our country, and they're stealing your country from you. And that was the message on January 6th. And I think that's why we saw that rage and violence just unleashed at the Capitol, which very, very, very similar to the rage and violence that was unleashed in 1898, focused on a different seat of government, on a city government, but the way we got there was very similar.
And it always strikes me in terms of thinking about, we like to say, if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. And this notion of societal transition, societal change, for the late 1800s, the battle over race and the inclusion and the bringing in of former slaves, now freed Black men and women into society, both politically and economically. We're seeing a kind of similar societal transformation and dynamic playing out now, aren't we? In terms of the continuing diversification of the country. That was evident in the late 1800s. It's evident now, isn't it?
Right, and that was perceived as a threat to the American way of life, basically. I mean, in 1898 and today. I mean, just look at Georgia for an example. Stacey Abrams, who was able to overcome voter suppression and get the vote out, and to win Georgia, which I think shocked everybody, and then to win the two Senate elections. I think in some part in using the shock and revulsion that voters had over January 6th. So I see these same themes, as you say, repeating over and over again. And I don't think we've learned much from history, at least not in this case.
Talk a little bit. I mean, you're a journalist, and we've got some great questions already from folks. Please submit some more. We'll be happy to take as many as we can. But one more question that I had that I wanted to get your input on, because you are a journalist, you are working in the media, the power of the media to influence and sway public opinion. We saw that with Daniels and the News and Observer and how he used that bully pulpit of print to be able to sway public opinion. We're seeing it today, the segregation and the sorting of Americans and their news consumption. Is this something we need to be cautious and think about in terms of moving forward from your standpoint as a journalist?
Absolutely. I mean, what's completely different today than in 1898 is that people get to pick the news they want. They get to pick the news that fits their preconceptions and their beliefs. And you see this in the rise of right-wing media and Fox News and all the internet sites and QAnon that feed into people's insecurities and their fears and their resentments and just incites them to take action and just feeds their prejudices. So as much as we in the so-called mainstream media try to be accurate, to be thorough, to be fair, it almost doesn't matter because we're not reaching those people who decide to select their own sources of news and not read the mainstream press because they've been told over and over by Donald Trump and others that that's fake news, it's socialist and it's liberal, don't believe it. And that is a very, very frustrating position to be in, no matter how true and accurate your reporting is. It's disregarded. It's not seen at all. And if it is seen, it's disregarded as fake news.
Okay. We're going to get a couple of questions here from our viewers. Anne wrote, Sally. Sally's got the first question here. Do you have any idea what role white women played in this insurrection?
Yeah, some of the most, I guess, open calls for violence came from white women, mostly in letters to their husbands or to relatives saying you're not being aggressive enough. Really? This was in the days leading up to the coup, and in fact, the cousin of Alfred Moore Waddell really chastised him and said, "You are not doing enough. If you really need it, we white women can come out and show you how to do it." During the day of the coup, white women came out with water, with pancakes, with ham and biscuits to feed the white gunmen who were coursing through the town, and brought them water and kept them fed. So I mean, that was their supportive role, but they also cheered and encouraged them. There was a huge parade the day after the coup where all the red shirts and we haven't talked about the two state militias that were involved in it. Yeah. They paraded through town with Confederate flags and playing Dixie, and the women were out there in their white dresses, waving white handkerchiefs and cheering them along. So they did have a very important role. And
the symbolism of white dresses on women, the purity of the white female in this played into this race-based notion of how society should operate.
Well, exactly. Yeah. The term that Josephus Daniels used was the black beast rapist. That's who he kept talking about. And what was really interesting, in 1898, almost a quarter of the white population was illiterate. And Daniels figured out how to get around that. He hired a political cartoonist who drew these just horribly racist cartoons depicting black men as beasts and monsters. I mean, literally with their hands reached out, grasping at white women. So that was a pretty effective message to white men, to incite them to violence, to protect the purity of white women in the South.
One of the questions that was up, Ken, I believe it was Ken, asked about Daniels and the NNO, and has there ever been any kind of formal apology for the role that the Raleigh newspaper played in this? Has the Raleigh News and Observer ever apologized for Josephus Daniels' legacy of white supremacy?
It certainly has, but only after the Daniels family sold the paper. When McClatchy took over, they ran I forget, something like a 13-part series written by Timothy Tyson at Duke University that told the full and true story of what happened in 1898. And on the editorial page, the newspaper openly and explicitly apologized for the newspaper's role, and particularly for Josephus Daniels' role. And just last summer in June, the Daniels family took down a statue of Josephus that had been in a park across from the old News and Observer building. So there has been a real recognition at the News and Observer that they were on the wrong side of history. And I should mention that the Charlotte Observer ran the same series and also ran a similar apology on the editorial page, because the Charlotte Observer was also very much involved in disinformation and spreading the big lie in 1898.
Anne asked a question about the spat of voting rights voting revision laws that are currently being considered by numerous states, is again a kind of connection back 120 years ago.
Yeah, I think the last time I read it was something like 250 different bills in state legislatures around the country pushed by Republicans to try to make it more difficult for Democratic-leaning groups to vote, particularly African Americans. And as I mentioned in the book, what we have today is very similar to what we had in 1898 as far as white conservative male politicians. Now, we don't have the violence and the open, naked racism we had back then. But in North Carolina, we have a legislature where the Republicans are completely white. Everyone in the Republican Party in the legislature is white, most of them males. And as probably most of people listening in today, they passed a voter ID law after bombarding the state elections board for information on what days did Black citizens vote, how many had driver's licenses, what kind of identification did they carry, did they vote in early voting, did they vote souls to the polls, and they used that information to craft a voter ID law to require the type of identification that a lot of African Americans didn't have, and to cut back, particularly on the souls to the polls, which is the Sunday voting by African American churches. It was the voter ID law was overruled by the federal courts. In one decision, it said that the voter ID law targeted African Americans with surgical precision. The state legislators today also used another tactic that the 1898 white supremacists used, and that was gerrymandering. They gerrymandered 2 wards in Wilmington, remember, was a Black majority city, and they tried to dilute the power of Black voting by cramming them into 2 districts. Well, today, the white conservatives in the state legislature in North Carolina have gerrymandered 28 legislative districts and 2 congressional districts that look like snakes or salamanders. And what they're doing is taking all the African Americans and crowding them into a couple of districts, leaving all the other ones safe for white Republicans. Several times the federal courts have thrown out those districts, and as you know, the Republicans keep redrawing them to try to meet the court's objections, but the courts did rule that they were illegal racial gerrymanders in violation of the 14th Amendment, that race was the predominant factor, and that they were not political gerrymanders, that they were racial gerrymanders. And this fight is still going on, as you know better than I do.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. North Carolina redistricting is, a cottage industry unto itself. Going back to the 1990s when the Bush Department of Justice had a maximization policy of wanting to create majority-minority districts, but knowing that the ramifications would be if you take Black voters who were reliable Democratic voters and pack them into districts, that indeed you would leave white voters that were mostly Republican in the South. And so it's every 10 years is always a challenge to try and keep up with who's in what district and what court cases are being dealt with in terms of North Carolina redistricting. You may or may not know the answer to this question, but I find it interesting because we started off the conversation with how little people know about this particular event in our history. John writes, how is the Wilmington coup insurrection taught in North Carolina public schools today? Have you gotten any feedback from teachers, from educators about your book and about its impact in the potential classroom activities?
Yes, at several book talks I've given around North Carolina, teachers have come up to me afterward and said, I've been trying to get this on the curriculum. It's not on the curriculum, but I'm teaching it anyway. I'm defying the local school board. And separately, and I forget the group, but there is a teachers group that is campaigning to have this taught correctly and accurately in the schools. If you read in the last chapter of the book, I quote from several textbooks from the 1930s and 40s in North Carolina that were just shocking, and how they completely bought the white narrative of a black riot, and called the so-called riot a good government initiative because black men were corrupt, and unfortunately the whites had to step in and restore good government. That was as recently as the 1940s. There are people alive today who studied that in school. So there is a movement afoot to get the true and accurate story in North Carolina textbooks. But right now there's almost nothing in the current books. There's very, very little about it.
And that kind of segues into a final question before we turn it back over to Catherine, that I'm fascinated to get your input on. Several issues, as we've noted, from the 1890s to the present in the 2020s. But one that I'm really deeply fascinated and deeply concerned about as both a historian, as a political scientist, is the falsifying and mischaracterization of our history to really present a narrative that's really designed for one group in our society to the potential detriment of other groups. There are those that want to discount or perhaps ignore what our history as a state and what our history as a country has to say about our current events. I'm curious, from your perspective, after writing this book and thinking about where we are as a country now, what can your story about Wilmington help us to realize in understanding who we are as a state and who we are as a nation?
Yeah, I think it can teach us that history is written on the fly by the people involved and by the victors. In this case, the people who perpetrated the riot got to define the narrative, and it lasted for quite a while. Today, we see how effective Donald Trump is in creating his own narrative and getting 74 million people to vote for him and to believe it. So there is power in disinformation. I mean, the big lie can really motivate millions of people to action. And I think it really plays in to grievances that people have, fears and insecurities they have, that they want someone to come in and tell them who to blame. And you get scapegoating, and you get the other, and you get people motivated to act out, as we saw on January 6th. So this is very concerning to me, that we have this kind of polarization in our country today, and it's not unprecedented. But our history, I think, the way it's taught, has been whitewashed, to use an unfortunate term. But I think there's just been a real attempt by the people in power, which tend to be well-to-do white people, in shaping the narrative of this country's history. That has a lot of truth to it, but leaves out a lot of important elements and a lot of context.
What would you say would be a way to address that? What do we as Americans need to do to work towards overcoming that deficiency?
Yeah, I mean, read your history, read accurate depictions of history, and that's hard. That's hard to know. But we need to teach more context and more depth in our schools on the narrative of this nation. And I'm not saying it was all bad. This is a great country, and it's unique around the world. But there are undercurrents of racism and nationalism that are unpleasant, and that have been just ignored in the traditional way that history has been taught. And we need to look at the whole picture and get a more nuanced feel of how this country came to be what it is today.
We've got I'll end with this. Ashley's question. You mentioned how important language is. In regards to education, what do you think about the changes to some social studies standards around the country to remove words like systemic from racism and discrimination, of the removal of standards that discuss slavery specifically? Do these measures contribute to the misinformation era?
Yeah, I think so, and that's been a big Republican push, particularly after the rise of Donald Trump. That's very concerning to me, that people are trying to frame history in a certain way rather than just telling accurately what happened. And this is something I really am not all that familiar with and need to really look into, because it's a little disconcerting.
Okay. Well, David, it has been a real honor and pleasure for me. Again, I have to recommend Wilmington's Lie, and I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to chat with you and to learn something myself from all of this. And thank you again for your time this evening. And I believe we'll turn it back to Catherine.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Oh, Michael, David, thank you so much. I feel like we just got started. That was the shortest hour of my day. Thank you for being here. And thank you for the work that you do on air, in print, in the classroom, on the speaking circuit. Your work addresses the deficiency that you talk about, Michael. We need to know this history. Our democracy depends on it. And thank you all for joining us tonight. This program is made possible by the support of the Arts and Science Council and the support of our members, without whom none of this would be possible. If you don't belong to Levine Museum of the New South, please join. Connect with us through social media. We've got some amazing programs coming up, including an event with Eddie Glaude Jr., and you won't want to miss it. So we look forward to seeing you all again on Zoom and in person at the museum, Thursday or Fridays through Mondays. Thank you all so much. Stay safe. Good night.
Good night. Thanks.